The alley was too quiet for midnight in Seoul, and that should have been Amara's first warning. But exhaustion from another 14-hour shift at the consulting firm had dulled her instincts enough that she didn't register the wrongness until the footsteps behind her quickened, and suddenly there were hands on her shoulders spinning her around and the cold circle of a gun barrel pressed against her temple. 3 men, their faces obscured by surgical masks and baseball caps. The one holding the gun muttering rapid Korean she only half understood, but the intent was clear from how the second man was already grabbing at her purse, and the third was reaching for her phone. Her heart kicked into her throat and her hands went up instinctively, the universal language of surrender, and she heard herself saying in English and then broken Korean that they could take everything, just take it, but the man with the gun wasn't listening. He was shouting now, spit flying, his finger too tight on the trigger, and Amara's vision started to tunnel because this was it. This was how she died in a foreign country 3 months into a contract that was supposed to advance her career. And her mother would never forgive her for taking this sole assignment, and the regret tasted like copper on her tongue. The man's shouting reached a crescendo and Amara squeezed her eyes shut because she couldn't watch, but the gunshot she expected didn't come. Instead, there was a different sound, something between a crack and a wet crunch, and suddenly the pressure against her head disappeared, and she opened her eyes to see the gunman on his knees, his arm bent at an angle that made her stomach lurch. And standing behind him was a man in a dark suit who moved like violence was a language he spoke fluently. He didn't look at Amara, not yet, his attention fixed on the 3 men who had seconds ago held all the power. But now the dynamic had shifted so completely it was like watching a scale tip from balance to catastrophic. The man in the suit said something in Korean, his voice low and casual, almost pleasant, and the 2 other attackers froze. The one who'd grabbed her purse dropped it like it had burned him. The man in the suit smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Amara's survival instinct scream, because there was nothing warm in it, nothing human. Just a baring of teeth that promised suffering, and then he moved. It happened so fast Amara couldn't track all of it, just fragments, impressions of brutality, the sound of bones breaking and men screaming, the way he didn't seem hurried or angry, just methodical, like he was completing a task he'd done 1,000 times before. The gun skittered across the pavement and came to rest near Amara's feet, and she stared at it stupidly, her brain still trying to catch up with the fact that she wasn't dead, that the threat had been neutralized, that she was somehow in more danger now than she'd been 30 seconds ago, because the man currently dismantling her attackers with surgical precision was clearly not a good Samaritan who just happened to be passing by. When it was over, all 3 men were on the ground, alive but broken, moaning and crying, and the man in the suit finally turned to look at Amara, and she felt the impact of his gaze like a physical thing. He was Korean, probably early 30s, handsome in a way that seemed almost irrelevant given the context, his suit expensive and somehow still immaculate despite what he'd just done. And when his eyes met hers, they were dark and assessing and entirely too interested. He didn't ask if she was okay, didn't offer comfort or call the police, just looked at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle and said in perfect English, "You should be more careful where you walk at night." His voice was deep, controlled, the kind of voice that expected to be obeyed, and Amara found herself nodding even though the statement was absurd, even though she'd done nothing wrong except exist in the wrong place at the wrong time, even though the danger radiating from this man was somehow worse than the gun that had been pressed to her head. She wanted to thank him, knew she should thank him, but the words stuck in her throat because gratitude felt insufficient and also dangerous, like acknowledging what he'd done would create a debt she couldn't afford. So instead, she just stood there shaking while he continued to watch her with that unnerving focus. Finally, she managed to bend down and retrieve her purse, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, and when she straightened, he was closer than he'd been, close enough that she could smell his cologne. Something expensive and subtle that didn't match the violence still hanging in the air around them. "Thank you," she whispered, because manners had been drilled into her since childhood and her mother's voice in her head was stronger than her fear, and he tilted his head slightly like he was considering her words, weighing them, deciding if they were sufficient. "You're American," he said, Not a question, and she nodded again, still clutching her purse against her chest like a shield. Working here. Another nod. Where? The question was casual, but something in his tone made it feel like a demand, and Amara's instinct was to lie, to protect her privacy, but her mouth betrayed her and gave him the name of the consulting firm before her brain could stop it. He smiled again, that same dangerous expression, and said, I know it. You should go home now, Amara Collins. Her name in his mouth made her blood run cold because she hadn't told him her name, which meant he'd known who she was before he'd saved her, or had learned it somehow in the seconds since, and either option was terrifying in its implications. She took a step back and then another, putting distance between them, and he let her go, didn't follow, just stood there in the alley surrounded by broken men and watched her retreat with an expression that looked almost fond, almost possessive. Like he'd just found something valuable and was deciding how to keep it. Amara turned and ran, her heels clicking frantically against the pavement, and she didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes on her the entire way, following her escape, letting her think she had a choice in leaving. The nightmare woke her at 4 a.m, images of the gun and the breaking bones and those dark assessing eyes all tangled together into something her conscious mind couldn't quite parse. And she lay in her small apartment staring at the ceiling and trying to convince herself she was safe, even though safety felt like a concept that had stopped applying to her life the moment that man had appeared in the alley. She'd filed a police report when she got home, called the emergency number with shaking hands, and 2 officers had arrived at her apartment to take her statement. But when she described her rescuer, their expressions had gone carefully blank in a way that made her stomach sink. They'd written everything down, promised to investigate, but their body language said they wouldn't, said they couldn't, said she'd stumbled into something larger and more dangerous than a simple robbery. She'd asked what they weren't telling her, and they'd exchanged a glance, and one of them had said very carefully that she should be grateful she was alive and perhaps consider being more cautious about her movements around the city. And then they'd left, and she'd locked every lock on her door and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. Sleep felt impossible, but eventually exhaustion dragged her under again, and when her alarm went off at 7, she felt worse than she had before sleeping, gritty-eyed and shaky. But the consulting firm didn't care about her emotional state, so she dragged herself through her morning routine and headed to work. The coffee shop on the corner of her building was her usual stop, a tiny place run by an elderly Korean woman who'd learned Amara's order within the first week. And Amara was standing in line rehearsing her Korean numbers in her head to pay when she felt it, that prickling awareness of being watched. She turned slowly, scanning the shop, and her heart stopped because he was there, the man from the alley, sitting at a corner table with a newspaper and a cup of coffee, like this was coincidence. Like he just happened to be in her coffee shop at her exact time on her exact morning. Their eyes met, and he didn't look away, didn't pretend he hadn't been staring, just held her gaze with that same unsettling intensity, while something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. Amara's hands were shaking again as she paid for her coffee, and she seriously considered skipping it entirely and just leaving, but that felt like cowardice and also pointless, because if he'd found her coffee shop, he knew where she worked, probably knew where she lived. And running would accomplish nothing. She took her coffee and walked toward the door, giving his table a wide berth, but his voice stopped her before she could escape. You slept poorly. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered in that same controlled voice, and Amara turned to find him watching her with something that looked disturbingly like concern. I wonder why, she said, and was proud that her voice came out steady despite the fear making her pulse race. Nightmares are normal after trauma. They'll fade. He said it like he had experience, like he knew the architecture of nightmares intimately, and maybe he did. Maybe he caused enough of them to understand their patterns. Who are you? The question came out sharper than she intended, and his smile returned, that dangerous expression that didn't reach his eyes. Park Joon-seok, he said, and the name meant nothing to her but clearly should have based on how the woman behind the counter had gone very still and quiet. And you're Amara Collins, 28, from New York, here on a 6-month contract with Seoul Consulting, living alone in Mapogu. The casual recitation of her personal information should have made her angry, but mostly it just made her tired, the kind of exhausted resignation that came from knowing she was in a situation she couldn't control. "What do you want from me?" It was the only question that mattered, the only thing she needed to understand, because men like him didn't save women in alleys out of altruism, didn't show up at their coffee shops for no reason. He considered the question for a long moment, his gaze traveling over her face like he was memorizing her features, and then he said, "I haven't decided yet." The honesty was somehow worse than a lie would have been, and Amara felt her grip tighten on her coffee cup hard enough that the cardboard compressed under her fingers. "I didn't ask for your help last night." "No," he agreed, "but you needed it, and I was there, and now here we are." The logic was insane, the idea that a single act of violence had created some kind of connection between them, but arguing felt pointless and also dangerous, so instead Amara just said, "I need to get to work," and headed for the door. This time he let her go without comment, but she could feel his eyes following her again, and when she glanced back through the coffee shop window he was still watching, still smiling, and she knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't over. That whatever Park Joon-seok had decided he wanted from her, he was the kind of man who took what he wanted regardless of the cost. The flowers arrived at her office 3 days later, an enormous arrangement of white roses that made her assistant gasp with delight and immediately start speculating about secret admirers. There was no card, no name, but Amara knew who'd sent them with the kind of bone-deep certainty that made her want to throw the entire arrangement in the trash. She didn't, because that would require explaining why expensive flowers upset her, so instead she smiled tightly and let her assistant put them on her desk where they mocked her with their beauty for the rest of the day. The pattern established itself quickly after that, a campaign of attention that was simultaneously subtle and overwhelming. He never approached her directly again, but his presence was constant in ways that made her skin crawl. The coffee shop woman started giving Amara her coffee for free with a nervous smile and wouldn't accept payment no matter how much Amara insisted. The creepy guy from accounting who'd been making inappropriate comments stopped talking to her entirely, actually crossed the street to avoid her when he saw her coming. Her landlord called to say there'd been a mistake with her rent. She'd been overcharged for months. Here was a refund, and also he'd upgraded her door locks and installed a security camera in the hallway. Every change was small, almost beneficial, but they added up to a suffocating awareness that Park Joon-seok had wrapped invisible threads around her life and was pulling them tighter. A month after the alley, Amara decided she was done being passive and went looking for answers. Her Korean coworker Mina was the closest thing she had to a friend in Seoul, a woman 5 years younger who'd taken Amara under her wing and helped her navigate both the office politics and the cultural differences. And over soju one evening Amara very carefully said Park Joon-seok's name and watched Mina's face go pale. "Where did you hear that name?" Mina asked, her voice dropping to a whisper even though the bar was loud and crowded and nobody was listening. "I met him," Amara said, and Mina made a sound that was half gasp, half whimper. "How are you still alive?" It wasn't hyperbole, Amara realized with dawning horror. It was a genuine question, and Mina spent the next hour explaining in hushed tones exactly who Park Joon-seok was. Enforcer was too small a word for it, soldier was too low a rank. He was high level, Mina said, the kind of man who had direct access to the organization's leadership, the kind of man who handled problems that needed to disappear permanently. He was known for being intelligent, brutal, and utterly without mercy, the kind of reputation that made other criminals nervous, and the fact that he'd saved Amara instead of killing her was bizarre enough to be unsettling. "Why would he help me?" Amara asked, and Mina shook her head slowly, her expression grim. "I don't know, but if Park Joon-seok is interested in you, that's not help. That's the worst thing that could happen." The words sat in Amara's stomach like lead, and she barely tasted the rest of her soju as Mina continued to explain all the reasons why catching the attention of a man like that was essentially a death sentence, just a slow one. When Amara got home that night, she found another gift waiting, a designer handbag that cost more than her monthly rent sitting outside her apartment door with no note, and she left it in the hallway, refused to bring it inside. But in the morning it was gone and she knew he'd taken it back himself, knew he'd been in her building, maybe watching to see if she'd accept it. The knowledge that he could reach her anytime he wanted, that locks and doors and distance meant nothing, sat like ice in her chest. And when she saw him again 2 days later, it wasn't at the coffee shop or her office, but at the convenience store near her apartment at 11 at night when she'd run out to buy ramen because she hadn't eaten dinner and was too exhausted to cook. He was in the alcohol aisle, studying soju labels like he had all the time in the world, and when Amara tried to turn around and leave before he saw her, he said without looking up, "The Shin ramen is better than the Jin ramen." His casual tone, like they were friends, like he hadn't been systematically invading her life for weeks, made anger flare hot enough to temporarily override her fear, and Amara found herself walking toward him instead of away, found herself saying, "What do you want from me?" with enough force that the clerk looked over nervously. Park Joon-seok turned to face her fully, and up close under the harsh fluorescent lights she could see details she'd missed before, the faint scar along his jawline, the way his eyes weren't entirely dark but had amber flecks that caught the light, the fact that he was even more handsome than her traumatized memory had registered, and that made her angrier because it felt like a cheat, like danger shouldn't be allowed to wear such an attractive face. "I told you," he said calmly, "I haven't decided yet." "Well, decide faster or leave me alone." The words came out braver than she felt, and something flickered in his expression, something that might have been approval or interest or both. "You're not afraid of me." "I'm terrified of you," Amara corrected, "but I'm also tired of being passive while you do whatever this is." She waved her hand vaguely, encompassing the flowers and the gifts and the constant surveillance. "I didn't ask for your protection or your attention or your creepy stalker routine." "No," he agreed, still calm, still watching her with that unnerving focus, "but you have it regardless." "Why?" The question came out almost desperate, and she hated how much she needed to understand, needed some kind of logic to apply to this impossible situation. Park Joon-seok was quiet for a long moment, his gaze traveling over her face, and then he said, "You were supposed to die in that alley. Those men were sent to kill you, not rob you." The world tilted sideways and Amara grabbed the shelf next to her for balance as her brain tried to process the information. "What?" "A competitor wanted to send a message to your consulting firm. You were chosen randomly, wrong place, wrong time, wrong face." His voice was matter-of-fact, like he was explaining weather patterns instead of a murder plot. "I was there to handle a different problem and saw what was happening and intervened. So you saved me by accident." The words felt hollow, and he shook his head slightly. "I saved you because when you looked up at that gun, you weren't begging or crying. You were calculating, trying to figure out how to survive, and I found that interesting." The explanation made no sense, was completely insane, but Amara could see in his expression that it was true. That her survival had come down to a split-second assessment by a killer who'd found her composure under pressure entertaining enough to warrant intervention. "And now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Now I'm still finding you interesting." He said it simply, like it was obvious, and took a step closer. "You're smart, you're stubborn, you don't scare easily once the immediate threat passes, and you're beautiful in a way that makes men stupid." Another step, and he was close enough that she could smell his cologne again, that same expensive scent that would probably haunt her for years. "I'm not a good man, Amara. I do terrible things for terrible people, and I don't feel guilty about it. But I'm honest about what I am, and I protect what's mine. I'm not yours." The protest was automatic, but it sounded weak even to her own ears, and his smile returned. "Not yet," he agreed, and the confidence in those two words made her shiver. "But you will be, because you're already thinking about it, already wondering what it would be like, and that curiosity is going to win eventually." He was right, and she hated that he was right, hated that somewhere in the last month of fear and anger and confusion, genuine attraction had started to take root, a dangerous fascination with the way he moved and spoke and looked at her like she was something precious and breakable that he wanted to both protect and destroy. "I should go," Amara said, but she didn't move, and neither did he. "You should," Park Joon-seok agreed, "but you won't." Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more interesting episodes. Not yet. because you have more questions. He was reading her too easily, understanding her too well, and that was dangerous in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Did you really stop those men from killing me, or did you kill them after I left? The question came from some dark place inside her that needed to know exactly how much blood was on her hands by proxy, and his expression didn't change. I let them live that night. They were dealt with later, but not by me. The careful phrasing told her everything she needed to know, and Amara felt sick. You're a killer. Yes. No denial, no justification, just flat acceptance, and somehow that honesty was better than a lie would have been. And you're interested in me? Yes. This is insane. Yes, he said again, and his hand came up slowly, giving her time to move away, and when she didn't, he touched her face, his fingers gentle against her cheek in a way that completely contradicted everything she knew about him. But you're interested too, and that makes you either very brave or very stupid. I haven't decided yet, Amara said, throwing his own words back at him, and his laugh was low and genuine and made something warm unfurl in her chest despite her best efforts to suppress it. He pulled back before the moment could become something more, before she could do something catastrophically stupid like lean into his touch, and said, "Go home, Amara. Get some sleep. I'll see you tomorrow." It wasn't a threat, wasn't even really a promise, just a statement of fact that made her believe in inevitability, and when she finally left the convenience store with her ramen forgotten, she could feel him watching her walk away. And this time the sensation didn't feel entirely threatening, which scared her more than anything else had. The next 3 weeks were a study in cognitive dissonance as Amara tried to maintain her normal life while being increasingly aware of Park Joon-seok's presence at the edges of it. He didn't approach her again directly, but the signs of his attention were everywhere, small interventions that made her life easier and simultaneously reminded her that she had no privacy. A colleague who'd been taking credit for her work suddenly stopped and actually apologized. Her terrible apartment's heating system was fixed within a day after she'd mentioned the problem to Mina. She got a reservation at an impossible-to-book restaurant she'd mentioned wanting to try, and when she showed up the host had her name and a table for one with an ocean view. Every kindness felt like a chain wrapping around her, binding her to him in ways she didn't know how to resist, and the worst part was that she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to resist. She started noticing him in person too, no longer making any effort to hide his surveillance. He'd be at the coffee shop when she arrived, at the bookstore when she browsed on weekends, once even at the Korean language class she'd started attending to improve her skills. He never sat near her, never interrupted, just existed in her space like he had every right to be there, and gradually the fear started to transmute into something more complicated. A mixture of anxiety and anticipation that made her heart race when she spotted him. Mina noticed the change and cornered her one afternoon after a meeting, her expression worried. "You're seeing him, aren't you?" she asked, and Amara shook her head. "Not the way you mean. He's just around." "That's worse," Mina said flatly. "Amara, you need to get out of Seoul, break your contract, go home. Men like Park Joon-seok don't have relationships, they have possessions, and once he decides you're his, you won't be able to leave." The advice was sound, logical, exactly what Amara would have told a friend in the same situation, but the thought of running back to New York felt like defeat, like letting fear win, and also there was the uncomfortable truth that she didn't want to leave. That the thought of never seeing Park Joon-seok again created an ache in her chest that had no business existing. "I can handle myself," Amara said, and Mina's expression shifted to something like pity. "No one can handle men like him. They're not human the way we're human. They don't feel things the same way." But Mina was wrong about that, Amara thought, because she'd seen the way Park Joon-seok looked at her, and there was feeling there, intense and overwhelming, the kind of emotion that was dangerous precisely because it was so powerful. That night she couldn't sleep, her mind spinning in circles, and at 2 a.m. she gave up and went for a walk, telling herself she needed air but knowing she was hoping to see him, hoping he'd materialize out of the darkness like he always seemed to. The streets were empty and quiet, just the occasional taxi passing by, and Amara had made it 3 blocks from her apartment when she felt it again, that awareness of being watched, But this time it felt different, wrong. The sensation coming from multiple directions instead of just one. She turned around, walking faster back toward her building, and that's when she saw them. 3 men falling into step behind her, not the same ones from the alley but cut from the same cloth, predators who'd identified prey. Her heart kicked into overdrive and she started running, heels clicking frantically against the pavement in a horrible echo of that night a month ago, and she could hear them behind her, gaining, and she knew she wasn't going to make it to her building, wasn't going to reach safety. The hand grabbed her arm and spun her around, and she was opening her mouth to scream when a different hand covered it and Park Joon-seok's voice said low and urgent in her ear, "Don't make a sound." He'd appeared from nowhere, pulling her into a recessed doorway, his body between her and the street, and she could feel the tension in him, coiled violence waiting to be released. The 3 men ran past, their footsteps receding, and Park Joon-seok kept them hidden for another 30 seconds before he pulled back enough to look at her face, his expression hard. "What the hell are you doing out here at 2 in the morning?" The anger in his voice surprised her, and she felt her own temper flare in response. "I couldn't sleep. I didn't know I needed permission to leave my apartment." "You need to be smarter than this," he said, his hands still gripping her arms, holding her in place. "Do you have any idea how many people would love to hurt me by hurting you?" The words registered slowly, the implication sinking in. "So this is your fault. Those men were after me because of you. They were after you because you matter to me and that makes you a target." He said it like it was obvious, like she should have understood the risks, and Amara felt something break inside her, the careful control she'd been maintaining shattering. "I didn't ask for any of this." The words came out louder than she intended, echoing in the empty street. "I didn't ask to almost die in an alley. I didn't ask for you to save me. I didn't ask to become your project or your obsession or whatever the hell this is." "I know." His voice was quieter now, his grip loosening, but not releasing. "And I'm sorry, but it doesn't change anything." "Why not?" She was crying now, frustrated tears streaming down her face. "Why can't you just leave me alone?" "Because I don't want to," Park Joon-seok said, and the raw honesty in his voice made her breath catch. "Because I think about you constantly. Because I can't remember the last time I cared whether someone lived or died, and now I care very much whether you live or die. Because you make me want things I didn't think I was capable of wanting." His forehead dropped to rest against hers, an unexpected intimacy that made her shiver. "I'm not good for you, Amara. I know that. But I'm too selfish to walk away." She should push him back, should run, should do anything except stand there in a darkened doorway with a killer's breath on her face and feel desire pool hot and urgent in her stomach. "This is insane," she whispered, and he made a sound that might have been agreement or amusement. "Yes. You're going to ruin my life." "Probably." The acknowledgement should have been horrifying, but instead it was almost liberating, an acceptance that this situation had no good outcome, no happy ending, just escalating intensity and inevitable disaster. "I should hate you." "You do," Park Joon-seok said, "and you also want me, and those things aren't mutually exclusive." His hand came up to cup her face, thumb wiping away her tears. "I'm not going to make this decision for you, Amara. If you tell me to leave you alone, I will. I'll make sure you're safe from the fallout, and then I'll disappear from your life completely." She knew he meant it, could hear the sincerity in his voice, and that made it worse because now the choice was hers. The responsibility for whatever came next would rest entirely on her shoulders. "And if I don't tell you to leave?" The question came out barely audible, and his eyes darkened with something that made her pulse spike. "Then I take you home and keep you safe, and we figure out what this is together, knowing it's probably going to end badly." It was the worst offer anyone had ever made her, wrapped in brutal honesty instead of pretty lies, and Amara knew accepting it was the stupidest thing she could possibly do. "Take me home," she said, and watched something fierce and possessive flash across his face before he kissed her, hard and demanding and absolutely nothing like the gentle first kiss she'd imagined in whatever naive part of her brain had thought about this. His mouth was unrelenting, and she met him with equal force, weeks of tension and fear and unwanted attraction exploding between them, and when he finally pulled back they were both breathing hard. "We're going to regret this," she said, and he smiled that. dangerous smile that made her heart race. Absolutely, he agreed, and took her hand and led her home, and Amara followed, knowing she was walking into disaster and unable to make herself care. The next month was a descent into something Amara had no framework to understand, a relationship that existed in the spaces between normal and catastrophic. Park Joon-seok didn't try to be someone he wasn't, never pretended his work was anything other than criminal, never hid the violence that was as much a part of him as his heartbeat. He'd show up at her apartment at odd hours, sometimes in suits that cost more than her furniture, sometimes in all black with blood on his knuckles that he'd wash off in her sink like it was routine. He never told her details, never implicated her in his business, but the evidence was there in the split knuckles and the occasional bruise, in the phone calls he'd taken rapid Korean before kissing her forehead and disappearing for days. Amara knew she should be horrified, should end this before she got in too deep, but the truth was she was already deep, had been since that first night in the alley, whether she'd admitted it or not. He was attentive in ways she'd never experienced, remembered details from throwaway comments, brought her books in English from a specialty shop because he'd noticed her Korean reading was still slow, stayed up with her when work stress kept her awake even though she knew he had his own dangerous business to handle. The contradiction of his gentleness with her versus his brutality with the rest of the world should have been frightening, but instead it felt like a privilege, like she was seeing a version of him no one else got to see. The sex was intense and often rough, Park Joon-seok taking her with a possessiveness that made her feel claimed in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying, his hands on her body like he was memorizing her, learning her, branding her as his. He never hurt her, not really, but he pushed boundaries and tested limits and pulled responses from her that she didn't know she was capable of, and afterward he'd hold her with a tenderness that made her chest ache. "You're mine now," he said one night, his voice rough with satisfaction, and Amara didn't argue because it was true, had been true for weeks, maybe had been true since that first encounter in the alley. She'd given herself to a monster, and the monster was surprisingly careful with his prize, which didn't make him less dangerous, but made the danger feel manageable, survivable, worth the risk. But the universe had a way of reminding Amara that nothing about Park Joon-seok was safe, that the illusion of stability was just that, an illusion. It started small, a feeling of being watched by people who weren't him, shadows that felt wrong, cars that seemed to follow her home from work. She mentioned it to Park Joon-seok and his expression went carefully blank, the kind of expressionless mask that meant he was thinking violent thoughts. "Stay close to me," he said, and Amara felt the first real flicker of serious fear, because if Park Joon-seok was worried, then the threat was significant. He assigned people to watch her, men who looked like him, cold-eyed and dangerous, who followed her everywhere and made her coworkers whisper. Mina stopped talking to her entirely, the association too dangerous now, and Amara felt the isolation keenly even though she'd known it was inevitable. Her life was narrowing, focusing down to Park Joon-seok and his world, everything else falling away like it had never mattered. The attack came on a Tuesday afternoon in broad daylight outside her office building. She was walking to lunch with her guards flanking her when the black van pulled up and men poured out with guns, not pointed at Amara but at her guards, and in the chaos someone grabbed her from behind and dragged her toward the van. She fought, screaming and kicking, but the hand over her mouth was efficient and she was being shoved into the vehicle when one of her guards managed to get a shot off and suddenly Park Joon-seok's man was down and bleeding and the guard was shooting again, dropping the man holding her. She fell hard onto the pavement, her head cracking against the concrete, and the world went fuzzy and strange, sounds muffled and vision blurred. More gunshots, more shouting, and then Park Joon-seok was there, materializing from nowhere, his face a mask of cold fury as he killed the remaining attackers with brutal efficiency. She tried to sit up, but he was already lifting her, cradling her against his chest, and she could hear him speaking rapid Korean into his phone, his voice tight with something that might have been fear, and she'd never heard him afraid before. The hospital was private, expensive, the kind of place that didn't ask questions when a known criminal brought in an injured woman, and Amara drifted in and out of consciousness while doctors examined her. Concussion, they said. Mild, she'd be fine with rest, and Park Joon-seok stood in the corner of the room like a statue carved from rage, his hands clenched into fists, and when the doctors left he came to her bedside and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "This is my fault," he said quietly, and Amara wanted to argue, but her head hurt too much, and also he was right. This was his fault. Being with him had painted a target on her back, and now people were dying and she'd almost been kidnapped and possibly killed. "Who were they?" she managed to ask, her voice rough, and Park Joon-seok's jaw tightened. "Rivals. They're trying to force my organization into a conflict by targeting you, proving we're weak if we can't protect what's ours." The casual reference to her as property should have made her angry, but she was too tired, too overwhelmed. "What happens now?" "Now I eliminate them," he said simply, like discussing weekend plans, "and make an example that ensures no one tries this again." The promise of violence made her shiver, and he noticed, his expression softening slightly. "I need to keep you safe, Amara. That means either you come with me completely, live in my world under my protection, or I let you go and make sure you're not a target anymore." The choice he was offering wasn't really a choice at all. They both knew it, because letting her go meant severing the connection that made her valuable, which probably meant faking her death or sending her away permanently, erasing her from his life so completely that she'd never be able to return. The thought of that erasure made her chest constrict painfully, and she reached for his hand before she could stop herself, her fingers wrapping around his like she could anchor him there. "I don't want to leave," she said, and watched relief flash across his face before he locked it down. "Then you come with me, starting tonight. No more apartment, no more routine, no more pretending this is something it isn't." His thumb stroked across her knuckles, a gentle gesture that contradicted his harsh words. "You'll live where I live, go where I go, and you'll do what I say when it comes to your safety, because I can't protect you if you fight me." The terms were essentially captivity dressed up as protection, and Amara knew accepting them meant surrendering the last vestiges of her independence. But the alternative was losing him entirely, and that felt worse than any loss of freedom. "Okay," she whispered, and Park Joon-seok leaned down to kiss her forehead, his lips lingering against her skin. "I'll keep you safe," he promised, and she believed him even though belief felt like foolishness, even though she knew that safety in his world was relative at best. They left the hospital after dark, Amara still dizzy but functional, and Park Joon-seok took her to a penthouse apartment she'd never seen before, high up in Gangnam with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. It was beautiful and sterile, the kind of place that looked like it came from a magazine, all clean lines and expensive furniture and no personal touches. "You live here?" she asked, and he shook his head. "I live in several places depending on circumstances. This is the safest one right now." He guided her to the bedroom, sat her down on the bed that was easily twice the size of hers, and disappeared into the bathroom. She heard water running, and when he returned he helped her stand, undressed her with clinical efficiency, and led her into a bathroom that was bigger than her old apartment's entire bedroom. The tub was filling with water, steam rising, and Park Joon-seok helped her in with a gentleness that made her want to cry, everything about the day catching up with her. He washed her hair, careful of the bump on her head, and she let herself lean back against the tub and just exist while he took care of her. And when the water started to cool, he lifted her out and dried her and dressed her in one of his shirts and put her in bed like she was something fragile. "I have to go," he said, standing beside the bed, and Amara's hand shot out to grab his wrist. "Where?" "To end this," he said simply, and she knew he meant violence, knew he was going to kill the people who'd tried to take her, and the knowledge should have disgusted her, but instead she just held his wrist tighter. "Come back," she said, and his expression softened into something almost tender. "Always," he promised, and kissed her hard before pulling away, and then he was gone and Amara was alone in a stranger's penthouse trying to process how completely her life had been dismantled. She didn't sleep, couldn't sleep, just lay in the dark listening to the city outside and trying to understand how she'd gotten here, how she'd gone from a cautious consultant with a careful career plan to a Mafia enforcer's kept woman in the space of 2 months. Every choice she'd made had seemed reasonable at the time, defensible, but they'd added up to this. to lying in a bed that smelled like Park Joon-seok's cologne waiting for him to return from murder and hoping desperately that he'd survive whatever violence he was walking into. He came back at dawn, silent as always, and she felt the bed dip as he climbed in beside her, still fully clothed. She rolled over to face him and could see blood on his collar, someone else's blood, and he was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "It's done," he said, and she didn't ask for details, didn't want to know exactly how many people had died because of her, so instead she just moved closer until she was pressed against him and let him hold her while the sun rose over Seoul. The next few weeks established a new normal that was surreal in its domesticity considering the circumstances. Park Joon-seok didn't let her return to work, citing safety concerns, and after a tense phone call with her consulting firm where he spoke to her supervisor in cold Korean, her contract was quietly terminated with a generous severance package that she knew he'd arranged. She should have been furious at his interference, but she was too tired to fight, too overwhelmed by how completely her life had changed to care about a job that felt like it belonged to someone else now. She spent her days in the penthouse reading and learning to cook Korean food from online videos and trying not to think about how completely dependent she'd become. Park Joon-seok came and went at irregular hours, sometimes affectionate and present, sometimes distant and preoccupied with business she couldn't ask about. He brought her gifts she didn't need, jewelry and clothes, and once an expensive laptop when he noticed her old one was dying, and every gift felt like both an apology and a collar, a reminder that she was being kept even if the cage was luxurious. The sex remained intense, Park Joon-seok taking her with a possessiveness that bordered on desperation, like he needed to prove to himself that she was real and his and safe, and Amara met his intensity with her own. Finding release in the physical connection that was the only place they were completely honest with each other. Afterward, he'd hold her and occasionally talk, giving her glimpses into his world that she knew she shouldn't want but craved anyway. He told her about growing up poor in Busan, about being recruited young by the organization, about climbing ranks through a combination of intelligence and ruthlessness that had made him valuable. He never expressed regret for his choices, but sometimes she caught something in his expression, a weariness that suggested the weight of all that violence was heavier than he pretended. "Do you ever want to leave?" she asked one night, her head on his chest, his heartbeat steady under her ear, and he was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Every day," he finally said, "and never. This is who I am, Amara. I'm good at it, I'm valued for it, and I've done too much to ever walk away clean." His hand stroked through her hair, the gesture absent and soothing. "But with you, I want different things. I want mornings and normalcy and a future that isn't measured in how long I can survive, and that wanting makes me weak, and that weakness is going to get one of us killed." The brutal honesty made her ache, and she turned to kiss his chest, right over his heart, a wordless acknowledgement that she understood the impossibility of what they were trying to build. "I don't regret it," she said, and felt him tense beneath her. "You should. I've ruined your life." "Maybe," Amara agreed, "but it's my life to ruin, and I chose this." She propped herself up to look at him, needing him to see her face, to understand she meant it. "I'm not some helpless victim you forced into this. I knew what you were and I stayed anyway, and that's on me." Park Joon-seok's hand came up to cup her face, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid." "I still haven't decided," she said, echoing that conversation in the convenience store months ago, and his laugh was quiet and genuine and made warmth bloom in her chest despite everything. But the warmth didn't last because nothing in Park Joon-seok's world lasted. Stability was an illusion, and the next fracture came from inside his own organization. She was in the penthouse alone when she heard the door open at the wrong time, in the middle of the afternoon when Park Joon-seok was supposed to be in meetings, and her first instinct was that he'd come back early, but something felt wrong, the footsteps too heavy, too numerous. She grabbed her phone and was dialing Park Joon-seok's number when 3 men appeared in the bedroom doorway, none of them faces she recognized, all of them carrying guns. "Put the phone down," the lead one said in accented English, and Amara's finger was hovering over the call button, trying to decide if she could connect before they shot her, when Park Joon-seok's voice came from behind them, cold and deadly. "I wouldn't if I were you." The men spun and Amara couldn't see what happened next, but she heard it, gunshots and screaming and the sounds of violence that would probably haunt her, and then Park Joon-seok was there, blood on his face that she hoped wasn't his, pulling her out of the room and down the hallway while more men appeared from nowhere, his men, forming a protective circle around them. They went down a back stairwell she hadn't known existed, emergency exit signs flickering overhead, and Park Joon-seok was speaking rapid Korean into his phone, his arm steel around her waist keeping her moving. They emerged in an underground parking garage, and there was a car waiting, engine running, and he shoved her into the back seat and climbed in after her, and they were moving before the door was fully closed. "What's happening?" Amara asked, her voice shaking, and Park Joon-seok's expression was grim as he checked his gun and reloaded with practiced efficiency. "Coup attempt. Someone decided they want my position and thought taking you would give them leverage." He looked at her finally, his eyes hard. "They were wrong." "How did they know about the penthouse?" "Inside information. Someone I trusted sold me out." The betrayal in his voice was subtle, but there, and Amara realized this was worse than external threats. This was his world turning on him, and she was caught in the middle. The car took them to another building, this one industrial and isolated, and when they went inside it was full of armed men who looked to Park Joon-seok with a deference that spoke to his rank. He left her in an interior room with 2 guards and disappeared for hours, and Amara sat on a concrete floor and tried to process the fact that her life had narrowed from a penthouse prison to a warehouse bunker, and somehow it kept getting worse. When Park Joon-seok returned, his knuckles were bloody again and his expression was carved from ice, and he dismissed the guards with a gesture and sat down beside her on the floor, his back against the wall, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "How bad is it?" Amara asked, and he didn't sugarcoat the answer. "Bad. I've been outvoted by the council. They think I'm compromised by you, that I'm too distracted to be effective." He turned to look at her, and she'd never seen him look defeated before, and it terrified her. "They want me to eliminate you or give you up, prove my loyalty." The words hung in the air between them, and Amara felt her heart stop. "Are you going to?" He laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "No. I told them to fuck themselves, which means I'm effectively excommunicated. Everything I've built, every alliance, every protection, it's gone." He reached for her hand, laced their fingers together. "I chose you over my entire organization, Amara, and now we're both in danger because the people who want my position will come for you to hurt me." She should tell him he was insane, should be horrified that he'd thrown away his power for her, but instead she just gripped his hand tighter and said, "What do we do now?" "Now we survive, Park," Joon-seok said, and pulled her close, and Amara buried her face against his neck and tried not to think about the fact that survival seemed increasingly unlikely. The next 3 days were a blur of movement, staying one step ahead of hunters who knew all of Park Joon-seok's usual patterns and resources. They moved from safe house to safe house, each one more makeshift than the last, and Amara watched him work his remaining contacts, calling in favors, spending the last of his goodwill to keep them alive. He was brilliant under pressure, she realized, strategic and ruthless and somehow maintaining his composure even as his world collapsed, and she fell deeper in love with him even as she recognized how damaged that love was. How it existed in the spaces between trauma and desire and Stockholm Syndrome and genuine connection. On the 3rd night, holed up in a shitty motel in a suburb she didn't recognize, Park Joon-seok sat on the bed cleaning his gun and finally said, "I can still get you out. I have contacts who can move you back to the States, give you a new identity if necessary, make it so they can't find you." His voice was carefully neutral, offering her the escape he'd promised once before, and Amara felt her chest constrict. "And you?" "I stay and fight. I've burned too many bridges to run, and my face is too well known." He looked up from the gun, his expression unreadable. "This isn't your fight, Amara. You got caught up in my world, but you don't have to die in it." She should accept, she knew that rationally, should take the exit he was offering before it was too late, but the thought of leaving him to face this alone made her feel physically ill. I'm not leaving you. Don't be stupid, he said, frustration bleeding into his voice. You're not equipped for this. You're not trained for violence, and you're going to get yourself killed for what? For me? I'm not worth it. That's not your decision to make, Amara said, moving to sit beside him on the bed, taking the gun from his hands and setting it aside. I know what I'm choosing, and I'm choosing you, even if it's suicidal, even if it's insane. She grabbed his face, made him look at her. You chose me over everything you'd built. The least I can do is stand with you now. Park Joon-seok's eyes closed briefly, and when they opened they were darker, more intense than she'd ever seen. You're going to die because of me. Maybe, she agreed, but I'd rather die with you than live without you, and that's my choice to make. He kissed her then, hard and desperate, and they fell back onto the terrible motel bed and made love with an urgency that felt like goodbye, like last times, and afterward he held her so tight she could barely breathe, but she didn't complain. Just let him hold on and tried to memorize the feel of him in case she didn't get another chance. The end came faster than expected. The next morning when Park Joon-seok's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize, and he answered to hear a voice that made his expression go cold. He spoke in Korean, short clipped sentences, and when he hung up he looked at Amara with something like resignation. They found us. They're offering a meeting, supposedly to negotiate, but it's obviously a trap. He started loading weapons, efficient and methodical. They have 3 of my people hostage, people who stayed loyal, and they'll kill them if I don't show. So it's a trap, but you're going anyway. I'm going because if I don't, good people die, and also because I'm tired of running. He looked at her, really looked at her, and she could see the decision he'd already made. You're not coming with me. Like hell I'm not. Amara stood, adrenaline making her hands shake, but her voice steady. We're in this together, remember? You don't get to martyr yourself alone. Amara, this is going to end in a gunfight. I might be able to talk my way out, might be able to negotiate something, but probability is that I'm going to die today. His voice was matter-of-fact, like discussing weather, but she could see the fear. Underneath, not for himself but for her. And if you're there, they'll use you against me, and I'll lose because I'll choose to save you over surviving. Then we go together, and we both survive or neither of us does, she said stubbornly, and Park Joon-seok made a frustrated sound. Why are you like this? Because I love you, Amara said, the first time she'd said it out loud, and watched his expression crack, genuine emotion breaking through. Because you're an idiot who threw away everything for me, and I'll be damned if I let you die alone for that stupidity. He crossed to her in 2 steps, kissed her hard, and when he pulled back his eyes were suspiciously bright. I love you too, which is why I need you safe. Too bad, she said, and his laugh was choked. You're going to get us both killed. Probably, she agreed, and he shook his head but stopped arguing, and they loaded into the car with the last 2 of his loyal men and drove to the meeting location in tense silence. The warehouse was exactly the cliché Amara would have expected, industrial and isolated, and when they pulled up there were already cars there, men with guns visible. Park Joon-seok's men took positions, but they were outnumbered at least 4-1, and Amara could feel the tension radiating from Park Joon-seok as he assessed the situation. Stay in the car, he said, one last attempt at protection, but she shook her head and got out with him, and his hand found hers and gripped tight, and they walked into the warehouse together. The interior was dim, harsh work lights creating shadows, and in the center was a man Amara didn't recognize flanked by armed guards, and kneeling on the floor with guns to their heads were 3 people who looked terrified. Park Joon-seok, the man said in English, probably for Amara's benefit, you've been difficult to locate. Kim Sang-woo, Park Joon-seok replied, his voice cold, I see you've moved up in the world. Tell me, did you plan this coup or were you just opportunistic when you saw weakness? The man, Kim Sang-woo, smiled unpleasantly. You made yourself weak when you chose her over the organization. Sentiment is a liability in our business, as you're about to learn. He gestured to the kneeling people. You can save them or her. Choose wisely. It was an impossible choice designed to break Park Joon-seok, and Amara felt his hand tighten on hers, felt the tension in his body as he calculated angles and odds, and found them all terrible. Or, Park Joon-seok said calmly, option 3. His gun was out before Amara registered the movement. 2 shots fired in rapid succession, both hitting guards near the hostages, and then everything exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from all directions, Park Joon-seok pulling Amara down behind a concrete pillar, returning fire with precision even as she covered her ears against the deafening sound, and she could see his men moving in her peripheral vision. Coordinated and professional, outnumbered but better trained. Kim Sang-woo was shouting orders, his people moving to surround them, and Park Joon-seok was firing methodically, each shot counting. But there were too many and Amara knew they were going to die here, both of them, and the knowledge felt almost peaceful. Almost acceptable, at least they'd be together. Then she heard it, more gunfire but from a different direction, confusion in the enemy ranks, and Park Joon-seok's expression shifted to something like surprise as new people poured into the warehouse, a lot of new people, dressed in tactical gear and moving with military precision. "What's happening?" Amara shouted over the noise, and Park Joon-seok was watching the new arrivals with an expression she couldn't read. "Back up, I didn't know I had," he said, and dragged her toward where his 3 people had taken advantage of the chaos to break free of their captors, and they were all moving toward an exit when the shot came from behind them, a crack that echoed through the warehouse. And Park Joon-seok stumbled and then went down hard, blood blooming across his side, and Amara was screaming his name and dropping beside him, her hands going to the wound automatically, trying to stop the bleeding. He was still conscious, looking up at her with an expression that was almost apologetic, and she was crying and pressing on the wound and yelling for help, and the tactical team was securing the area, neutralizing the remaining threats with brutal efficiency. Kim Sang-woo was on his knees, bloodied and defeated, and someone in tactical gear was approaching Amara and Park Joon-seok, pulling off his helmet, and she recognized the man from somewhere, one of Park Joon-seok's former contacts maybe. But she couldn't focus on anything except the blood on her hands, and the way Park Joon-seok was trying to say something but couldn't quite manage it. The tactical team leader was speaking into a radio, calling for medical, and Park Joon-seok's hand found Amara's, gripping weakly, and she leaned down close to hear him whisper, "I told you we'd both survive or neither of us would." And his smile was bloody but genuine before his eyes rolled back, and he went limp in her arms, and Amara was screaming again, hands slippery with his blood as the medics arrived and pulled her away and started working on him with frantic efficiency. Someone was trying to lead her out, telling her she needed to let them work, that he had a chance if she got out of the way, but she couldn't move, couldn't look away from Park Joon-seok's unconscious form, couldn't process that after everything they might still lose, that he might die anyway and she'd be alone with the weight of all these impossible choices, and this damaged love that had never made sense, but had somehow become the center of her entire world. The tactical team leader was in front of her now, saying something about protection and safety and a car waiting, but the words weren't penetrating, and then there was another commotion from the warehouse entrance, more people arriving. And through the chaos, Amara saw Kim Sang-woo being dragged toward a different exit, saw him turn and look at her with hatred, saw him mouth something that looked like, "This isn't over," and one of his remaining loyal guards was raising a gun, the barrel pointing. Not at the tactical team but at Amara, and she watched it happen in slow motion, watched the finger start to squeeze the trigger, heard someone shouting a warning, and the sound when the shot came was somehow both deafening and distant. And she couldn't tell if she'd been hit, or if someone had intercepted the bullet, or if this was just how dying felt. Like everything was happening underwater, like time had stopped making sense, and the last thing she registered before the darkness took her was Park Joon-seok's hand in hers going slack, and she didn't know if that meant he was dead or she was dying, or if they were both slipping away together into whatever came next, the question hanging unanswered in the space between consciousness and oblivion. Thanks for staying till the end. Kindly like, share, and subscribe for more captivating stories.